So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today we are going to talk about everyone's favorite subject from 2019, scooters. My name is Heather Hamilton. I'm a project manager at BSC Group, a civil engineering firm in Boston, Massachusetts. I also serve on my town's select board and created a pilot program so that shared scooters could operate from April 1st, 2019 to November 15th, 2019. Next, we have Sharda Strassmore. Sharda is the Shared Mobility Planner at the District of Columbia Department of Transportation. Her portfolio of dockless bike and scooter share includes managing the current permit process, imagining dockless programs of the future, and planning for how new mobility can exist in public space. Sharda's passion for urban planning and active mobility came from experiencing the district on foot and by bike. Prior to joining the public sector, Sharda worked at Goldman Sachs and the Pedestrian Institute for International Economics. And finally, we have Jacob Sherman. Jacob is the new mobility program manager at the Portland Bureau of Transportation, and he also manages its e-scooter pilot program. In these roles, he works on strategy, policy, and programs to ensure changes in Portland's transportation system are safe, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and improve access to opportunity for all Portlanders. Outside of the transportation sector, Jacob has experience in a diverse set of areas that span from political campaigns to academia, and from environmental justice to urban sustainability and more. Jacob also serves as a planning commissioner in his town. He holds an MBA with a focus on innovation and entrepreneurship from Portland State University. We will begin with a facilitated discussion between the three of us on our experiences with micromobility, and then leave about 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and I will try to work them in as they come in. So let's begin. Jacob, why don't you provide a very brief discussion of the scooter program in Portland?
Sure, thanks, Heather. So we've had scooters in the city of Portland since 2018. We had our first pilot. It was a 3-month pilot. And we walked out of that pilot recognizing that we thought there was a lot of opportunity for scooters and challenges. And so we kind of had a recommendation to do a second scooter pilot. And we're kind of in the middle of that second scooter pilot right now. That's been about 14 months or so. We've got we started with 6 operators. We're currently down to 4. Had 2 operators kind of leave the market. We've had a fleet that's kind of ranged between 2,000 to 3,000 scooters. And I think it's been a really interesting experience. And in September, we kind of published a big findings report in terms of everything that we'd learned kind of during the 2019 calendar year, some of the COVID impacts, and then some of our recommendations for how we as an agency want to integrate scooters into our transportation system in a more permanent sort of way.
Excellent. Sharda, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So in DC, we've also had scooters since 2018, which I think might have been the beginning of scooters for everyone. We have around 7,000 scooters permitted right now, and 7 operators for scooters and 2 bike operators. We did have 8 at one point, but that number has dropped down. And later we can talk about why less operators might be better for a city. We in DC have had Capital Bike Share, a docked bike share system since 2010. And I think as scooters began and people began seeing them everywhere, there was a greater understanding of how they were supposed to work and what was supposed to occur in the city because they'd already had this knowledge of a docked bike share system. Just gonna briefly talk about ridership. We were getting about 500,000 trips a month pre-COVID. Since COVID, our first month of April, we're seeing the numbers. They went to 10% of pre-COVID. We've gone up to 15, and right now we're at 30%. And so it's really interesting and good to see that people are following like the stay-at-home orders and how that has affected the fluctuation in ridership.
Yes, and we will get to that in more detail. So Brookline, Massachusetts was one of 2 communities in Massachusetts to go forward with a pilot program on shared mobility. We have a state law that mentions scooters, and so a lot of communities didn't feel comfortable experimenting with this technology when the state legislature basically needed to address the ambiguity in the existing state law. But Brookline decided to go ahead. So in 2018, I was looking at both of your programs actually, and trying to take the best of what I saw, which there was a lot to work from. And we formulated a pilot program. We are about 6 square miles less. It's like 6 miles across and then like 2 miles wide. And we're basically this tiny little place sandwiched between Boston on 3 sides of us and then Newton to the west. We have about 60,000 residents. So we permitted about 200 scooters to start. We started with 2 companies, Lime and Bird. So it was 100 scooters per company. And we wanted, enough time to be able to really see if we needed to make adjustments halfway through the program. So we decided to do about a 7-month-long pilot program in the bulk of 2019. We had over 170,000 trips. And what's astounding about that number is because the other communities were not on board, we needed to build into the pilot that the micromobility devices couldn't essentially leave our jurisdiction. And so Lime allowed users to finish their trip. They could go into another community, but they couldn't return. They couldn't start another trip once they exited out of the border. Bird would literally shut off the device once it crossed into another jurisdiction. If it ended up in another jurisdiction, per our agreement, the company had 2 hours to go and collect it so that it didn't, basically create the bad neighbor scenario that a lot of our abutting communities were worried about. So I think it was a success. We did have one fairly public injury right on launch day. So, we'll definitely talk more about safety and the correct speed and the correct placement on the streetscape for these devices further into the dialogue. So why don't we first begin by talking about the contractual relationship with some of these vendors. I myself assumed that I had to treat it like a regular RFP, and I have since learned there are multiple variations of ways that you can partner with companies. It really depends on, what is allowed under state law. So Sharda, why don't you talk about how you navigated that process and whether or not you went with a traditional RFP?
Yeah, so we have permitted the scooters in the district using a right-of-way permit. The process we've gone through, we had a 2019 permit, which ended up being extended due to the health crisis as we got delayed. And we're now about to go into a year-long permit for 2021. A permit is very different than an RFP because it's asking if people are qualified and capable of operating, and then meeting the terms and conditions that have been set. So each company agrees to a set of terms and conditions, which if you're curious, you can find it on the DDOT DocList webpage. So like Heather talked about picking vehicles up within 2 hours, like that's something that we definitely require when it comes to misparked vehicles. So is for us, the permitting process is more about meeting the terms and conditions and having the operational ability to do so. Jacob, do you guys permit as well? Or you're moving?
Yeah, so in our 2018 pilot, we permitted, and in a very similar way. Here's a set of administrative rules. Here's a set of qualifications. Are you able to meet these rules and provide the necessary documentation? If so, pay your fees and receive your permit to operate. We had 3 companies kind of start and finish that process. As we kind of came out of our first pilot in 2018 and launched into our second pilot in 2019, we decided that we wanted to kind of try and find a way to select companies that were better suited to help us advance some of our goals around safety, goals around equity, goals around kind of climate and congestion reduction. So what we did then was kind of a blended kind of a permitting process with more of a kind of a contractor and RFP process. So we kind of had a competitive permit process where we had kind of set a minimum qualifications. The company had to kind of make it over that. And then some companies didn't. And then for the companies that did, we kind of went into kind of a competitive scoring round. So we had, I believe it was 13 companies that applied, and we ended up only permitting 6. And at kind of where we are now in our program, as we're thinking about how scooters and more permanently integrate into our transportation system, is we've kind of made the conclusion as an agency that we plan on kind of leaving the permit structure behind and moving more towards kind of a contractual relationship, whether that be a no-cost contract, a revenue sharing agreement, some other kind of mechanism. But as we've kind of think broadly about this space, we often kind of think about some of these new mobility services and whether we're taking a strict kind of regulatory approach, whether we're looking at some blend of kind of regulatory towards partnership, which we often kind of refer to as enabling, or whether we take a true partnership kind of approach. And I think we're hoping to kind of move from that regulate more towards that kind of enable and partner space, because we think that that's going to help us better advance progress on some of those goals.
Yeah, I think, in 2018, 2019, a lot of companies were coming onto the scene and experimenting, and we're not going to see as many operators that are able to, put out 100 scooters to start and whatnot. I will encourage those viewers to really look at the city of Salem in Massachusetts. It's not necessarily a sole source, but they went with one operator, and they contracted with a management group to oversee that. So you have a management team overseeing, the scooter deployment. And if I had to do it all over again, I might model our program after that. So I encourage people to look at that program. So moving on, because I want to try to get to all of the topics in this, basically half hour, 45 minutes. Operations and logistics. A lot of people, when these devices were starting to come onto the scene, a lot of anxiety around parking. Now, one of the things that impressed me the most about Washington, D.C.'s program is not only the very forward-thinking policies that you had around parking, but also the experimentation, especially with docks and charging. So, Sharda, do you want to, say what you guys have learned over the past 2.5 years?
Yeah. So we don't currently permit docks due to restrictions around advertising on the docks and the ability to put things in public space. But I'm sure anybody who's operating, anybody who's working in this position that I have is also getting a lot of inquiries from companies who would love to place docks in public space frequently. But one of our vendors, Spin, one of the operators, they have started a a program to place docks in private space. So they create relationships with various properties, and they have charging typically located at these stations, docks, stations, parlance. So they have these across the district where you can receive a discount on your ride if you park there. When you think about it, it reduces labor costs. You don't have to go find a scooter to charge it. You know it's parked correctly because there's a slot for the stem so it can't tip over. And it's we also have a lot of corrals across the district that we've been working to install. So my colleagues have put in nearly 100 corrals, which include parking for about 4 bikes and then space for, I'd say, about 6 to 8 scooters, depending on the size of it. And our latest development is council legislated Lock 2, which will start in October of 2021. So a tethering device on each vehicle to lock it to something. This also will include the deployment of more bike racks, which is great because now we have data, right? So scooters are amazing. Shared scooters are amazing because they provide data, which can be used to place bike racks. So if you see people ending trips someplace, like a lot of trips in certain locations, you can then choose how to target your deployment of bike racks or your deployment of protected bike lanes to really make sure that you're being responsive to the needs of the public.
You know, it's interesting. Kind of, you mentioned kind of charging stations. You know, that's been a hot topic, I think, with us as well. We've had a lot of folks kind of engage with us and ask us questions, and I think in a very similar way, we're really interested in it because I think of how it could help serve as like an organizing principle in the right of way. And as you mentioned, kind of the benefits around charging and reducing VMT from operations and vehicles driving. The hard part with us in a real similar way, Sharda, is the most operators or companies, like, this is built on an advertising model where, you know, they want to be able to provide this service to advertise. And I think some of that is also to create that additional revenue stream to help like support the business. And our community as well has a lot of restrictions around advertising in the right of way, especially digital advertising in the right of way. So this has kind of been one of those places where just sometimes you can just kind of spend a lot of time talking and not see a lot of action. We've also kind of piloted kind of parking corrals in our second pilot. We didn't have them in our first pilot. In our second pilot, I think we put out like 24 kind of scooter parking corrals, you know, kind of using decals kind of on the streets. You know, I'd say saw kind of marginal success around that. We didn't require operators to kind of display those in app, which I think means people just don't really know about them as much. And we didn't also require kind of operators to deploy to them. I think we kind of had a preference, but it wasn't a hard requirement. So things become a little tricky there. We're also very seriously thinking about Lock 2 as something that we want to integrate in a permanent program, because we think it solves kind of a lot of the challenges that we've heard from various members of our community, whether that be seniors and elders or people with disabilities. And we're kind of currently undergoing an exercise right now, and I could pull up a slide later when we're talking about data to look at where trips are ending in comparison to some of our existing infrastructure in order to kind of identify gaps and then think about what those infrastructure needs would be. So that's been, I think, an interesting thing. It's been interesting to hear from folks in San Francisco who kind of talk about it as the key to their success, and folks in Chicago who also have Lock 2, where I think they were saying 60% of complaints decreased after kind of implementing that. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what other cities are thinking about or talking about kind of in that space.
I think the complaints are interesting because they tend to decrease as your program continues, right? So it could be just a second round versus an actual
Totally.
decrease.
Yeah, I mean, we saw, I think, from our first pilot to our second pilot, we saw a decrease in complaints. And then we actually did kind of some quick analysis on complaints in our second pilot. And we actually, 42% of our complaints came from 3 individuals. So, you have those frequent flyers as well.
We're getting some questions in the Q&A about parking, and I'll just weigh in. I think 2 of the questions, how do you enforce the 2-hour collection? Difficult. I mean, part of the advantage of these devices is that you know exactly where they are and for how long. So if we have evidence that a scooter was left somewhere for over 2 hours, we fine the company, and all of that is defined in the agreement. So they're somewhat incentivized, but things happen.
I think we also test, right? Like the other day, I can see from my window there was a bike that had tipped over and was just chilling, and I tested it. I said, "Hey guys, you got to get this." And did they get it in 2 hours? Good work.
Yeah. Part of our challenge is it does kind of rely on someone to complain, and then once they receive the complaint, then the clock starts. These devices they're starting to get to the point where I think the technology is going to be able to differentiate between the sidewalk and the street. That's created a lot of logistical problems, the fact that right now they can't. But I think, as we enter 2021, 22, hopefully they will be able to tell the difference between when they're upright or when they're knocked over, when they're on the sidewalk, when they're not on the sidewalk. And we'll be able to geofence basically areas where they just are not really allowed. And hopefully we'll get down to such a granular detail that we will, both the city as well as the companies will know when a scooter is not where it's supposed to be. But that's still some time off. I want to slide into the topic of safety. Some of the questions are getting into that. And maybe I'll start off with, at what speed should these scooters be allowed? Now, manufacturally, I think they are capable of speeds as great as 20 miles per hour. I actually testified before our state legislature on a bill that was before them that it needed to be 15 miles per hour to be able to keep up with bicycling traffic, where most of our bike lanes are going to be, where we want these scooters operating. But if I had to do it all over again, I might actually take the position of 12 miles per hour. I think that's, if that sidewalk riding is going to happen, there is a major difference between 12 miles per hour and 15. So what say you, Jacob?
I think this is a really good question. I would say I don't feel confident in a good answer. The state of Oregon, based on how we classify scooters through our Oregon Vehicle Code, state that an electric scooter can't travel more than 15 miles an hour. So that is our kind of upper threshold set by state law. There are a variety of places where, kind of through geofencing and speed governing technology, we've reduced or required operators to reduce speeds down to 12. And I think we're trying to figure out kind of what that sweet spot is. I don't really know of any evidence-based research that's been done to kind of really answer what safe speeds are, particularly in kind of higher conflict areas, shared use paths, for example. And so I think absent some of that information, it becomes hard to kind of figure it out. And I think that's where I think cities often kind of rely on kind of best practice and see what other cities are doing and kind of employing those technologies. I think we also have, I think, an interesting thing as well. We have shared electric bicycles, Biketown, our fleet, and in our state, how scooters are classified by the Oregon Vehicle Code and how e-bikes are classified, they're very different than one another. So the speeds for e-bikes, I think, is capped at 20 miles an hour. And so you could have a shared e-bike using the same facilities as a shared scooter at different speeds, when I think many people also think about those things as kind of functionally similar. Again, I think it's a sticky wicket, and I'd really be interested if any researchers, safety researchers are out there are able to kind of pull off some interesting studies to help give us some of these answers. Sharda, what about you all? I think you're also doing some kind of speed governing, right?
We can. We had a council legislative speed limit of 10 miles per hour, which will be, which as vehicles are recategorized will be no longer in existence as our council legislative speed limit. So this is something that we definitely have been thinking about a lot. I've seen a study, which is like most of the injuries happen in the first 10 rides. And so like we've been banding around ideas of like what would be like a good way to increase the speed, right? So maybe you don't let newer riders go 15 miles per hour, and then there's like a lower speed mode where you can try it out the first couple times you ride, so that you're just not you have longer times to make decisions. Our bikes are capped at 20 miles per hour, which is, doesn't feel that fast when you're on a bike. But I rode a scooter that was not capped, which was going 16 miles per hour when it failed our speed test. And it was scary for me as like an experienced bike rider and as like somebody who's ridden a good amount of scooters. It just feels like you're so much more dependent on the smoothness of the road and like nothing going wrong. I also saw a question in there about using recreational trails. In the district, we have an interesting recreational trail thing going on where most of our trails are federal. So the district trails, we are working to allow scooters on, but there's just there was no way to do it federally until recently. So super interesting to ask about that.
We allow scooters to operate wherever bikes are allowed to operate. That being said, I'm not sure that I would take a scooter on something that is not paved. Which also leads me to try to address some of the other questions about safety of the devices themselves, and more of a focus on the individual rider's responsibility. So Lime for Existence offered driving academies where they requested use of one of our schools. We have, basically this beautiful track area behind one of our schools that was a great course for learning. It's spongy ground, so if you accidentally fell off, they taught you, they were giving away helmets, they taught you how to balance on these things. You really do need to get acclimated to these devices, because I think where a lot of people go wrong is they assume that it's like riding a bike and your center of gravity is just different. That being said, I think everybody younger than us, they grew up on these Razor scooters. They're already somewhat acclimated. I mean, I can see 12-year-olds who should not be using these scooters, due to state law. But they seem way more balanced than somebody who, took it out, 5 times last week. That's much, much older. So I definitely think that if you go forward, you should partner with the vendors to offer some sort of driving academy so that people can get acclimated to the devices. One of the biggest disappointments for me was this false sense of security when we were presented with this opportunity. The app, asks you to take a picture when you end the trip. And that is supposed to say whether or not you parked the vehicle in an appropriate place. And so I think a lot of people assume that users are responsible, but if there's no enforcement or no review of their behavior on the tail end, then people are going to do what they're going to do. They're going to go too fast. They're going to use it in inappropriate spaces. So you have to have those policies in place that nudge people back to where you want them and how you want them to use these devices. So let's move on to data. So we partnered with a data operator, and they were able to basically kind of aggregate all the data so that we could see the multiple vendors and whatnot. And it was very beneficial to us to be able to use this information for other things that I'm pretty sure the other panelists have brought up, which is, where do you put other docking stations, or where might you put bike lanes? For us during COVID, we actually used the scooter data from last year to advocate for where we should widen public sidewalks, because we had the data of where people were moving about, the four, really high traffic areas. So Sharda, why don't you talk about what your experience has been with data, and what do you think works to your advantage, and what are you frustrated by?
Well, we currently receive MDS data for our, sorry, I will back that up and not use an abbreviation and make it make sense. We receive the mobility data specification, which was created by the OMF, the Open Mobility Foundation, and for our bikes, our dockless bikes. And as part of this, as Heather mentioned, she had used a data dashboard, an aggregator, a third-party aggregator to do that. And we do that work in-house in the district. So we have worked with our OCTO, our Office of the Chief Technology Officer, to create data infrastructure to be able to look at what we're getting and to be able to analyze what is actually occurring in the city. So one of the very interesting things that we have done with this is we've looked at it when it comes to the parking locations, which is what I talked about earlier. Then another thing that we've had a lot of issues with is geofencing, right? So we in DC have a huge chunk of the city, which is federal property. We are a state DOT and a local DOT, but we cannot permit somebody to operate on federal land because it's not our land. So we have worked with the operators to look at where they're actually parking vehicles on federal land, to have exclusions or geofences to push vehicles away from where they from that federal land. Data is an interesting way to be able to see what's actually going on. I see a question in here about regulating of private vehicles. And so shared vehicles offer a very different perspective, because private vehicles, you have no idea where they go. Like, people can bike wherever they want to bike. They can fall off their bikes and not report it. They have no interest in reporting it. But when it comes to a shared vehicle, you're more likely to receive data about accidents. You're more likely to receive, you're not more likely, you do receive the paths of travel and the origins and destinations, and you can help shape your infrastructure to meet that. And yeah, that's where I'm gonna stop. I could keep going.
How about you, Jacob?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And I think I want to take it like both high level and then get down into the weeds. And this is a space I spend a decent amount of my time kind of working in. So I'm not gonna try and take too long or go too deep. But I think it's important to first recognize, like, cities have collected information about our transportation system for a long time. And we've done it in ways like staff observations. We've done it in ways like asking people to complete kind of trip journals. We've done it in ways where we set out tube counters. And in a way, what we're doing now is kind of the evolution of all of those things to actually become kind of data-driven entities and organizations and use kind of data for kind of transportation planning and regulatory purposes. And I'd say in a really powerful way, because we're not just like taking a sample and thinking about what it might mean for the whole. We actually have the whole. We have all of the trips, all of, whereas, you know, there's a lot of limitations around kind of sampling. So that's, I'd say, kind of high level. As with a number of other cities, both in the United States, North America, Europe, and other places, we also use the mobility data specification. And I would say for anybody who's interested in learning more about that, I would encourage you to check out the Open Mobility Foundation, which is kind of serving as the steward of that specification. Like DDOT, we manage the data ourselves, working with kind of our IT professionals. And we've also partnered kind of with a third-party data aggregator to provide kind of other visualization tools and help on some of the kind of confirming the veracity of the information, and help with some of kind of, you know, using data for invoicing and billing. So we're kind of continue to explore both of those two paths in terms of, do we want to continue to do this in-house? Do we want to rely on kind of private sector and the expertise and kind of core competency that they bring? I don't think we have that necessarily answered. But I did, to maybe break the fireside chat up a little bit, I put together 2 quick slides, because I think like talking about data is a really like abstract thing for people that don't like see it. And so I'm going to share my screen really quickly. And I think you could probably see this now. So this is a slide from actually a presentation that I gave to City Council 2 months ago, talking about one of the ways that we use data is to kind of evaluate kind of some of the choices that we've made as a city. So some of the information we've required operators to provide us has showed how safe infrastructure investments have increased ridership. So between our first pilot in 2018 and our second pilot in 2019, we had a number of capital projects come on around the city, and we were able to do kind of pre-post comparison in terms of ridership. And we saw in some segments like this, an increase of 125% in ridership when we put in bike lanes, when we put in crosswalks. And in this way, we think that, you know, scooters are emblematic of what's also probably happening with personal bicycles, and yet we have no data about that. We've also seen kind of through the data, kind of the impact of some of the in-app education and rules that we've pushed out to riders, kind of dissuading them from riding in places like our waterfront park and encouraging them to ride on some adjacent infrastructure that was kind of recently built out. So I think we saw a 55% decrease in ridership in our park, and we saw a 45% increase on some of the new bike infrastructure that was kind of immediately next to that. This other slide, this is really cool. This is a project I'm working on right now, where we're looking at how where people ride scooters kind of relates to our existing bike parking infrastructure. So you can see kind of in these are heat maps of where trips are ending in part of our city. And these little dots are existing PBOT bike rack infrastructure in the right of way. So you can see that in some of these places, you know, maybe there's good infrastructure coverage. You see over here, we have a lot of infrastructure and not necessarily a ton of rides ending there. And you can see right here, there's a ton of rides ending right here. There's some infrastructure kind of down the street, but this is really leading us to start having conversations and maybe we need to be putting in some bike racks around here or talking to the property owner about putting infrastructure on their property. Clearly, there's a large amount of demand. I think these are the types of things that we can be doing with this sort of information that has been really hard to do in the past, or has been really onerous and labor intensive. And now we're able to kind of do this in a much more efficient way, kind of using some of the mobility data. So I'm gonna get off my horse there and let somebody take the next question.
I mean, that was a great visual. And, you know, I just want to say pedestrian and bicycling counts have always been very spotty. You know, it's always on down on the list of priorities. You never have enough staff. It's one snapshot of that day and particular time. And it was not painting the whole picture. And now we have a lot of data to be able to, you know, see the whole picture. Not a complete picture, but, you know, definitely a more fleshed out one. I know we were hoping to be able to integrate rideshare, so Uber and Lyft, into our data dashboard so we could see, you know, a more complete picture. Have you guys thought of that at all?
We've definitely thought about it. And, you know, we're kind of undertaking some work right now where, because of COVID, I think like many cities, we've become much more flexible with the right-of-way and how the right-of-way is being used. We have a healthy business program that is, you know, allowing street cafes, sidewalk cafes, parking lanes are disappearing. We've created kind of pickup drop-off zones. And I think we're really interested in partnering with the private sector to get some of the information in a safe way about some of the uses as it pertains, especially to kind of like food delivery and kind of parcel delivery, so that as we move out of the pandemic, we can make some kind of informed choices about where we might want to keep some of those pickup, drop off, delivery, you know, prioritized kind of spaces, and where we might not want to. Without that information, it's just a shot in the dark. Restaurants might not get what they want, even though they've got a lot of demand. And so I think those are things we're really interested in. Sharda, what about you?
We, I think, are interested in seeing how the shared mobility, single operator type, multiple vehicles turns out. I don't think we have a direct stake in the game for this. I see a question here about San Francisco installing drive-over counters in bike lanes to measure scooter ridership. And I just wanted to give a shout out to that one because it's a great question. We have discovered that scooters don't click our bike counters. So you ride over the bike counter and they're made out of a different material that doesn't actually respond to a bike counter. So fascinating little tidbit on scooters.
It is fascinating. I want to be cognizant of time. And so I wanted to cover two other areas, COVID and equity. And I think one or two of the questions in the Q&A brings up, you know, interactions or the intersection with transit. And you can't have an equity conversation without talking about transit. And then for a little bit of, you know, spice, let's throw in, you know, trying to get people out of single occupancy cars. You know, transit was the answer, but COVID is not really helping us in that way. So with all of that going on, equity, COVID, sustainability, and everything else, what are your thoughts? What have you seen in a post-COVID, you know, program, and how do you address some of the equity that was happening before COVID, now certainly with COVID, and how can scooters play a role in trying to get people to take something other than a single occupancy vehicle?
Jacob, you want to start?
Sure.
Sure. There's a lot there. I'm trying to like organize my thoughts. One of the things that we've done in our first and second pilot is pretty consistently do user surveys, where one of the questions we ask is essentially, but for a scooter, how would you have taken that trip? We've heard pretty consistently through those surveys, we have about an average kind of mode shift of about 35, 37%. away from single occupancy vehicles and onto scooters. Clearly, some of those people also, I think 10% also said they would have taken transit. A number said they would have biked and walked. And in some kind of analysis that we've done, kind of based on some life cycle analyses that we required companies to provide us with, we've said that kind of net on balance, we believe that scooters are beneficial from kind of a climate perspective, because they're shifting, that 35% of trips shifted out of single occupancy vehicles is having a much more kind of positive climate impact than like the negative impact from kind of the lower carbon mode kind of trip replacement that also occurs. So maybe that's kind of like as a start. I think kind of COVID more specifically, especially when operators were kind of shutting down across the globe, some operators didn't. And one of the things that we did, we had an operator come to us asking how they could be a good partner as transit was kind of closing down, other scooters were kind of closing down. And kind of they proposed to us kind of a partnership where we would reduce some of our fees in exchange for them reducing the cost of riding by 50%. This was in the early days of the pandemic. And what we saw from that was a pretty significant increase in ridership from that operator. I think it was a 45% increase in ridership overall, and over 130% increase in ridership in some of our historically marginalized and more underserved communities. I think since then we've been really curious, especially from an equity perspective, kind of the role that price plays in kind of people accessing these services or not. You know, when the cost of a 15-minute scooter ride is twice the cost of a 2-hour bus ride, it becomes really hard to kind of want to make that choice. So we are kind of undergoing some companies are currently doing kind of some price experiments in our city right now. And I'm really interested and curious to kind of look at that and see how that impacts ridership. That's kind of maybe a blend of the kind of sustainability and kind of equity side of things.
I think
Charlotte, what about
interested in hearing about these price experiments more. We had a fleet increase opportunity that was set at the beginning of COVID. So we allowed operators who had percentages of their trips from low income and essential worker customer plans. So specifically targeting groups that essential workers who had to be out and about, and these low income customer plans, which the companies had in play since the beginning of 2019, as a percentage of the overall ridership. And we found that some companies aggressively had the low-income customer plan customers already in play, and some companies just aggressively went after these fleet increases. With, I would say, 3 to 4 companies that have really bumped up their numbers in a way that will allow them to meet different, allow them to be able to deploy scooters across the city instead of focused in a specific downtown area. I think one of the concerns about having like a lower fleet cap for vehicles is the way that they're spread out across the city. So, you know, Jacob talks about the zones that he has for equity, and it's interesting to think about it. But when you think about the data, like when you're looking at origin destinations and you say, oh, like we're not getting a lot of trip starts from this location, you have to put vehicles in places for them to have trip starts, to have the origins, to have the ridership from an area. And I think part of being able to get to the point to do that is having enough vehicles that you can cover in our case, the district in a way that's effective, and that allows for those, allows for reliability. Because when, you know, you think about the cost of the bus is going to show up most of the time. It's been a while for me.
So Jacob, I'm so glad that you brought up the user survey. It was really one of the reasons why why Portland's program got on my radar in the first place. And we actually did a user survey of our own, because I was like, well, you know, there was so much data there. And one of the greatest surprises was the gender equity discovery, that, you know, in traditional biking facilities, it's actually very male dominated, for a multitude of reasons. Women are very risk averse by, you know, large categories. Until they feel safe, they may not go in there. But scooters feel a lot safer to women, by and large, than bikes do. And that was a discovery from doing the user survey. Our user survey, and I can't take any of the credit for this, it was one of our very informed seniors at our senior center that said, if you do a user survey, you're only going to hear from users of those devices. What about the rest of us? So we did a user and a non-user survey. It was basically a transportation questionnaire, but got at the same point. If not for these devices, what would you take? But also, how do you feel about these devices? Are they incentivizing you to take a car if they are interrupting your path of travel, if you're a pedestrian, for example? So we got a whole lot of really useful data. We had over 2,000 responses, so it was statistically significant. And we had more non-users reply than users. And the last question was, do you think that this program should continue? And 70% of respondents said yes. So I was very impressed by the response that we got, and it will shape another program whenever we decide to embark on that again. The other thing that I want to bring up is I think there has been an assumption that, at least I made this assumption, that scooter users are basically the same thing as bicyclists. And so when you introduce something like this, you're going to take away from transit ridership or bike share. And that's not actually the case. So going back to the data question, we also have bike share in Brookline, and that was integrated into our dashboard. And we actually saw that as scooter ridership went up, so did bike share. It was completely counterintuitive. So, you know, transportation is just a fascinating subject. We only have a few more minutes, so I just want to make sure that we've gotten to the majority of the questions, although
There's a good question. There's a good question in there about kind of how our programs have interacted with transit agencies, concerns about kind of conflict. You know, I think we've certainly kind of worked with our local transit agency, TriMet, and worked to kind of think about rules around kind of parking and deploying, especially around kind of transit stops. And I think we're kind of in continued conversations about how some of the data that we get might be able to kind of be informed, or they might be able to use that in kind of a meaningful way. We're also really interested as we kind of move into into this kind of permanent program about thinking about how scooters interact with other modes, especially transit kind of being one, but also shared bikes and TNCs, car share, and I think interested in seeing how we might be able to actually like integrate from an app perspective, integrate scooters with some of those other modes. Our transit agency has kind of really been involved in leading some of the discussions kind of nationally around kind of mobility as a service. And so I think that this is kind of an area for us of like continued exploration and partnership. But it has been really useful to have practical conversations about where should we have scooters parking and not parking kind of and deployed kind of in relation to kind of transit stops. Sharda, what, how are you all working with your transit agency?
We're working with them. We've had conversations around parking, similarly to the federal issue that we have about property ownership. It's a lot of private land, and by private I mean owned by WMATA, our transit agency, around the stations, and so it's an interesting question of what is the appropriate boundary next to the station, and who should be permitted to park at the bike racks at the station. we're still working out the details and thinking about it, but it's definitely an interesting conversation to be having when it comes to integrating the transit system into the way that these vehicles that are working with the as a first mile, last mile solution. I want to ask you guys a question that came up in the chat. So Meg Young asked about rating of the community of the different companies and including the perspective of the community in future applications. So when looking at the applications of the companies, what, I guess it's a reputation the community members have. Have you considered using your community surveys to address specific companies as you go through like an RFP or a permit process? She's thinking about it, that's why.
Well, so I just have to say that I was mistaken. I thought we only had until 1, or the top of the hour, I'll say, since we're all on different time zones. But we have 15 more minutes for this. So the question was, how would I rate the different companies?
No, it's, would you consider how the community rates the companies in your application and when you pick, when you permit or form agreements or partnerships with companies? Does the rating of the community matter in that, and how do they express it to you?
I'm not sure I follow the rating of the community.
Yeah, I mean, so she's kind of, I guess the question was, have you thought about like surveying community members to say, do you like the scooter company A or scooter company B or scooter company D more? And then using that information to kind of inform permitting. It's a really interesting question that I haven't personally thought about. But kind of the piece that in that question that I have thought about, but haven't necessarily kind of taken any action on, is that I think for cities operating scooter programs and using kind of data and kind of tracking that data, I think in some ways you get a sense of community preference based on how people spend their money and which provider they're choosing to take rides on, right? I think we see from a utilization perspective, we see very kind of different utilization from different companies. And I think that, I think as some people say, sometimes you vote with your dollar. I think that like shows some of that community preference in a way that like, maybe for lack of a better word, a popularity contest might not actually give you the honest results, whereas like how people are spending their money might be more accurate. This is just kind of my own kind of initial gut reaction.
My initial response to that would be that has too much potential to be kind of messed with, right? It's a popularity contest at the end of the day. So if you get people to sign on to saying, we want this company, how do I know that those people are honest actors? And there's too much at stake, to incentivize basically, people trying to rig the system in essence. I'm more persuaded by some of the active steps that the companies took that went above and beyond. Jacob mentioned a company that said, how can we help when this emergency is going on? There have been companies that look at, wow, parking is a problem. What do we do about it? Okay, we can't get people to drive responsibly and use the road instead of the sidewalk. What can we do as a company to hold our users accountable? Those are the things that I look at because they know who their customers are and they should be holding them accountable, but they're incentivized almost to look the other way, right? They're not going to penalize and then disconnect a user who's paying good money. So we have to figure out, okay, if we don't have enough police to enforce, how do we fix that incentive so that people are acting the way we want them to act and the companies hold people accountable because we don't have the resources to do it.
No, I think that brings up a really interesting point of fines. Jacob, Portland has fines, right?
Yeah, that was that was one of the things that we kind of changed between our first program, kind of where we didn't have kind of fines and violations, and we kind of implemented that in our second. And so we had some of our staff who do kind of vehicle inspections for TNCs, Uber and Lyft, as well as some of our parking enforcement staff, kind of documenting kind of instances of scooters kind of improperly parked, taking photographs that are geolocated, time, date, location. We also required companies to have kind of a 5 or 6 digit kind of alphanumeric number on the stem. And so then we started writing fines to the companies. So, a $25 fine for improper parking, with the expectation that companies would then turn around and pass that on to the user. And we issued kind of over 1,000 fines and kind of violations and warnings kind of in the 2019 calendar year. And I think that helped. And at the same time, it also became really hard to kind of know when and if the companies were actually passing those fines on to the users. It became a lot of like caveats for when they should or when they shouldn't. And for us, it was kind of, trying to really kind of close that loop became kind of an important thing. So I think as we're thinking about kind of the future, we're continuing to think about like how compliance kind of continues to play in this kind of space.
One of the questions in the from the audience was about rural and suburban. So
was it about rural or was it about suburban?
It was like rural / suburban. Brookline isn't rural, certainly. It is pretty suburban, and actually part of our equity conversation is about north versus south. So the northern part of Brookline is very dense, but the southern part of Brookline is not very dense and not very accessible to transit. I think there's only really one bus line that runs maybe like on the hour. So I guess the only thing I would say about rural and suburban programs is, what do you have to lose? Experiment with the technology and see what happens. Put safeguards in place, obviously. But you would be surprised. In looking at a number of programs across the country, some of the more successful programs were in places I would never have thought to put shared scooters. And that's because there are a number of people that cannot afford to drive. Whether it's a personal vehicle or renting, a car, there are just a number of adults in the US that have a hard time affording their own car. And so, in Kansas, you actually see great success because there are just so many adults that are not served by transit, and also they can't afford a personal vehicle.
I would also throw in there that it doesn't have to be a traditional shared scooter program where the vehicles are stored on the street. We've had several operators do a leasing program, for example, where an individual has the responsibility of a vehicle for a certain period of time. I think there's even a article that I read about San Francisco where they did that as well for a 30-day lease of the vehicle. And being able to take it home in like a less dense urban environment and know that you'll have the reliability of being able to use it the next day may be better for your users than the ability to have access to a shared scooter. I thought those beeps were mine.
Sorry, I said sorry, that was me. Somebody's calling. Apologies. Maybe since I so rudely interrupted you, well, since my colleague interrupted me, which interrupted you, you mentioned kind of the word individual responsibility, and I see kind of, it's not a question, but it's more of a comment kind of in the chat. And I just wanted to kind of take that, I think, for a second, because, I think the comment is more about, you seem to be focused on scooter companies and not on individuals operating the scooters. And And I think this is a really important thing that I think sometimes folks think that we can solve all the problems. Scooters equals world peace. If only you just regulated it correctly. But I think it's important for us to, as kind of public agencies, to also just think about how we educate folks kind of around some of that personal responsibility to kind of maintain their own safety and to think about their fellow citizens and neighbors. So we've tried kind of some messaging around how improper parking impacts people with disabilities, people with low vision or people on wheels, to kind of, again, kind of hit that individual responsibility message. Because I think as much as one might try and design like the perfect program that's going to solve all of the problems, at the end of the day, an individual makes a choice. And in some ways that choice might impact them, but it might also kind of impact others. And I think those of us that kind of work in or have colleagues who work in kind of vision zero, I mean, we see that every day with speeding or drunk driving. You see the impacts of, you can set rules and try and kind of maintain the system, but really in many ways individual responsibility is a key thing. That's one of the reasons I think we've really worked with companies to try and do kind of in-app messaging and rules, kind of like when renting a scooter, that kind of talks about wearing a helmet, not riding on sidewalks, parking properly, those kinds of things, so that, again, people are kind of aware of their responsibility as a citizen, not just to themselves, but to the larger community as well.
I think it's interesting to think about how you can actually speak to the individual, and in-app messaging is like just so personalized, and like you can use, not you can, but a company could use someone's location to push them a message about where they are, which is far more detailed than you can ever get by putting a message on the side of a bus that drives by, maybe, It's a fascinating direct delivery method.
I think
it's both good and bad that we have kind of this indirect relationship with the users. We don't know who they are, but the companies do. So, who's responsible for what? We certainly like having the data, and then the companies, but it relies on the companies to have that direct engagement with the users.
Well, and I think it goes to some of the, I think from our perspective, this is why you need companies that are good partners, right? And aren't just caring about maximizing profit, but are also thinking about some of these other kind of social and community values, and how do we maximize on those? Because I think, depending on that philosophy, you're going to get the company that sends the, Heather, we hope you ride safe today. Please do these things, think about others, and then you'll get a company that doesn't do anything, right? And so I think that's just kind of an important kind of consideration as well.
I think that came up in the Q&A, that not all of the vendors have been good partners. My advice is, when you have a contractual relationship, whether that's a licensing contract or an RFP, it's a specific limited period of time so that you can learn and you can enter into a new one with new partners if you find yourself partnered with someone you don't like.
I think this all speaks to the longevity of scooters, and the question of not the question, but the fact that they are offering a benefit to our transportation environment and creating the opportunity for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to move across the city in these ways to do it, and even adding a little fun into people's lives. That's what we hear most often about why people like scootering, is it's because it's fun. But it does create this question of, how do the companies support the city in continuing to offer these services, and training people and educating them on how to use vehicles is a very important part of the relationship.
Absolutely. You know, I just for fun, because I'm that much of a transportation nerd, I went back and tried to read some of the news clippings when the first automobiles started to come on the scene. And I mean, some of the accounts and the words that were used to describe this new technology, almost the exact same that we're encountering in our scooter, you know, public hearings about why, you know, the end is coming because we're allowing these devices. It's pretty ironic, pretty fitting.
I've seen similar things as well of, you know, going even kind of before vehicles to kind of horse and buggy carriages and in cities as well, and some of the conflicts that created. I think this is kind of an important thing where many of us in the public sector, we're managing change kind of at the city scale. And it's how do you manage change kind of responsibly and safely, right? And do that in the way that kind of reflects the spirit and values of your community. And I think that's where I know many cities have kind of, and universities have kind of been testing, but I think that's the importance of pilots in many ways, especially with kind of the adoption of new technology. And I know in the past, we haven't always had those opportunities because folks have kind of thrust the technology upon us. I think this has been a really interesting moment where kind of we've worked more in that partnership space with the private sector to kind of experiment, explore, test, and learn kind of together in a way that does kind of improve things, I think, in many ways, right? 35% mode shift is like that's a good thing. Accidents rates that are, you know, relatively low. Sure, we always want to get things lower, but I think that's just kind of also kind of an interesting thing to kind of consider in our work as kind of public professionals.
Before we conclude, because wow, the hour has gone by, I do want to just say one quick thing. You know, part of the reason I really wanted scooters in Brookline was to get people who were not using bike lanes into our bike lanes to see the condition of those facilities and to hopefully advocate for more funding so that, you know, the infrastructure is taken care of. Verdict is still out whether or not that's going to happen, but that was part of my thought process. So I just want to thank you both for agreeing to be on this panel. This was kind of my dream team when I was thinking about putting a panel on scooters. You know, Portland and Washington, D.C. are the two places that are getting it right, in my opinion. So this will be recorded and available later on. So check the Volution website. And I want to thank Megan and Hillary of Volution. And thank you for tuning in.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Heather.
Thank you all.
And thanks again to our panelists and our attendees for joining us. This was a great hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes to discuss a great topic. So we appreciate your time today. And just want to give a reminder to also check out our podcast. We have a monthly podcast out there on most platforms, definitely on Apple and iHeartRadio, as well as Stitcher. So you can find us pretty much wherever, but also on realvolution.org/podcast. And we have up there just a few of our most recent episodes. So if you're looking for more great conversations all about transit and mobility and development, check them out there. Thanks again, everyone,